Hello, my friend. It's time for our meeting this Sunday, May 18th. And I'll start by talking to you about Gazzetta do Povo again, because now there's an offer for our $8.25 per month for 1 year. Well, it's not our $100 per year to have all of Gazzetta do Povo's content. That's a 70% discount. It's a great offer. And look, Gazzetta do Povo is not in tune with the other media outlets that have commitments to the government because they receive money from the government. Gazzetta is not. Gazzetta is independent. Have you ever heard of independent journalism? That's it, right? Journalism has to be independent, because if it's not independent, it has no freedom. It has to speak only of one side, only praising the government, right? With the utmost shamelessness. And that's not what Christina Gremmel, the great Constantino who returned home, Lacombe, Nicholas Ferreira are doing at Gazzetta. I'm there with you, right? I trust Gazzetta, I consult Gazzetta, it has a great team, right? And Gazzetta's opinion is an opinion, not just a strong opinion, but an informed and well-founded opinion. So, put the QR code there or go to Gazzetta do Povo, right? I'll tell you here. gazzettadopovo.tudujunto.com.br/alexandriarja. There you can subscribe for $8.25 per month for a year. This is a great offer from Gazzetta. Well, let's get to today's topics. Don't forget to subscribe and at the end to like or dislike. Today's first topic is the missionary Pope Leo X. He gathered 150 great authorities from around the world, representatives from all over the world, for his first Mass. The Vice President of the Republic of Brazil, Geraldo Alckmin, was there, and he took the opportunity to invite the Pope to come to the COP in Belém. But the Vice President of the United States, Vente, was there, and Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, Zelensky, who went there with his wife, with Olenka, to ask for peace, right? To ask for the Pope's intervention. On the day that Putin is attacking Ukraine with a swarm of drones, right? Representatives, vice presidents of Latin American countries, in short, from all over the world. The strength of this missionary, humble and very practical Pope. I showed here when he was chosen, right? Choosing quickly shows the will of the cardinals to make the church return to being the real church, right? And in his first intervention he defended freedom of the press, he asked for the freedom of imprisoned journalists, right? And in the second a little while ago, he said it was obvious. Want to see what obvious he talked about? This here is the Aurelio Dictionary. It's the basics of the Portuguese language. So I'll go there as a family. Family. Then Aurelio says, what is family? It is the union of related people who generally live in the same house, particularly the father, the mother and the children. The Pope said that family, let's use the same words, right? To be very faithful, right? Well, family is the stable union between a man and a woman. Simple, direct, obvious, natural, right? By the way, the same dictionary there in couple. Couple, yes, see, I saw it mentioned here because I speak in Portuguese. I'm not discussing ideology, right? These other ones. Couple, couple for composed of male and female or man and woman. That's a couple, right? When it's not when there are two equals, it's a pair, right? That's the Portuguese language. But anyway, the Pope is showing that he's not the American Pope, he's the world Pope. He even speaks Portuguese, but he speaks fluent Spanish, Italian, right, and, obviously, English, right, since he's from Chicago. Well, the Pope of Brazilian politics, because of his age, today it's José Sarney, he was interviewed in Veja's Yellow Pages. And I highlight the following question. The attacks on the three branches of government are from Veja today. Was it an attempted coup on January 8th? That's the question. And José Sarney, former president of the Republic, during the Constituent Assembly, right? Well, and he's now in his 90s, answered. No, it wasn't an attempted coup, no. There was an excessive judicialization of politics and politicization of justice. Then I saw that he is worthy of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, because in a language, anyone who can say the essential, express the essential, in the minimum number of words, with short and clear words, deserves to be in the Brazilian Academy of Letters. This is the case with José Sarney's answer. It was an attempted coup on January 8. Answer. There was no excessive judicialization of politics and politicization of justice. Therein establishes a reciprocal relationship, an inversion, right? Well, then they asked, what about political prisoners? And he answers, we have to abandon political processes and see things factually. Look at the facts. Forget the politicization of the judiciary. Well, there are two mistakes there. One is by the person who interviewed him, who I think was either over the phone or recorded and couldn't get it out of the recording or didn't understand that he mentioned barracks campfire women and it was written in Veja as paper campfire women. And barracks flags was a phrase he even quoted from Marshal Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco, who said that the army had to be careful with barracks campfire women. They were the women who stayed near the camps, the bivouacs, right? Well, and barracks campfire women are the ones who whisper in the military's ear. Well, and he made a historical mistake, right? He said that General Walter Pires, who was Figueiredo's army minister, went to Goberry, the chief of staff, to say that the barracks would prevent him, Sarney, from taking office. Goberry was no longer the chief of staff, it was João Leteo de Abreu, who wouldn't admit that, nor would Walter Pires would talk to João Leteo de Abreu. If he was going to talk, he would talk to his friend, Figueiredo, right? And Figueiredo would say, no, but he didn't get involved in that either. No, that didn't happen. Well, now at the end he is the honorary president of the MDB, right? And he was from Arena, he was president of the government party until the very end. Then he moved to the PFL, but he didn't stay in the PFL, he went to the MDB and said he wants the MDB to support Lula for re-election, even though Temer is organizing a kind of center-right to prevent Lula from continuing. He has already spoken with Tarcísio, with Governor Caiado, right? Well, changing the subject now, the CPMI, Joint Parliamentary Commission of Investigation, right, of Inquiry, mixed CPI, that is, with senators and deputies. It has 224, if I'm not mistaken, signatures of deputies and 36 signatures of senators. It's in Alcalombre's hands, right? But he's putting more and more pressure on it. The government feels embarrassed. No, we don't want it. Police, who is the government's minister of politics, he said he doesn't want it. He doesn't want it. Why? Why don't he want it? They're not saying it started with Bolsonaro, so let's do it, right? But there are people who say it started in 2010. Well, if I had to give a date, I would risk mentioning 2017, which was the reason, when the labor reform ended the mandatory union contribution of 1 day of work per year, the equivalent of what we called union tax, because it's not a mandatory contribution, it's called a tax, right? The translation of that. From then on, the unions, what are we going to do now so we can continue with this standard of living? Wow, just take 1% of the INSS benefits. That's a lot of money, much more than 6 billion. Instead of taking 1 day, take 1% per month, right? That's when it started, I think. It's Law 13.467 of 2017, the labor reform. That's right. Hey, Portugal, hey, I was just taking a look, right? They're already there 11 p.m., but still by exit poll, okay? First, the center-right. It is the Social Democratic Party, right? But the party is the center, the Social Democratic Center, something like that. There are two parties together, it remains in first place. I am the one with the most seats, and in second, exit poll says that Chega and the Socialist Party are tied, which means that Chega has grown to have more seats. None of those in today's election will get an absolute majority, half plus one of the 300 of the 230 seats in the Assembly of the Republic, which is the parliament, right, which will choose the head of government, right? The president is the head of state and the parliament chooses. The party that has a majority will have to join the center-right, will have to join Chega to know what it will do. So, folks, that's it. From Brasilia, Alexander Garcia. Hello, my friends. This is the highlight of Thursday. Time for our meeting, our conversation. January 6th, Epiphany, when Christianity celebrates the arrival of the so-called Magi, right? They were astronomers, astrologers from ancient Persia, or something like that, and who followed a star that they identified as the birthplace of the King of Kings, right? The Star of Bethlehem. They passed by Herod, they went first to Herod. They were at a level, let's say, state, governmental. And Herod asked, "Look, later tell me where this king of Israel was born." Herod was already watching. They noticed, and when it was time to return, they didn't pass by Herod, right? Today is a holiday in the capital of Rio Grande do Norte, Natal, right? Because today they celebrate the Magi, who gave their name to the fort at the mouth of the Potengi River. Potengi, the river of shrimps, right? Potengi was one of the important bases during World War II. Getulio Vargas and Roosevelt met there, right? I'll talk about Roosevelt in a moment. And, anyway, there's also Cabral's marker, or the Portuguese's, right, in Pedrolios, which would have been left there in Touros, where Cabral first entered Brazilian territory, to establish markers to confirm Portuguese possession, since the Spanish were expanding on this side, right? It also marks 150, and I think it was the discovery of Angra dos Reis. The Portuguese also gave it its name. They discovered it on January 6 until the years 300 and 359 AD. Christmas was celebrated on January 6th because studies at the time showed that it had been on that day of the year, right? Well, today in the Spanish world, in the Hispanic world, let's say, it's the day of the tradition of giving gifts, just like the three wise men did, right? Well, here in Brazil, we have the traditions of the risados, the singing of the 12th night, right? Very beautiful traditions that should be, well, more celebrated and more protected. Well, don't forget to subscribe and at the end, leave your like or dislike. I mentioned Roosevelt. Well, today, January 6th, on a day like today, in 1941, Franklin Roosevelt gave a remarkable speech. Well, today Biden also gave a remarkable speech in the United States, because today marks 1 year since the invasion of the Capitol. And he gave a speech criticizing Trump, right, saying that Trump is lying and that the truth is not that of the history of how the American elections went. But let's go back to Franklin Roosevelt, where he talks about the four truths. I have the original of his speech here, and he says, in the future days, right? Well, what we see are human freedoms. The first is freedom of expression, freedom to speak, freedom of opinion. How current is that here in Brazil, right? The second freedom is the freedom of each person to worship their God in their own way. It was a freedom provided for in the Brazilian constitution and that was also affected, right? So, they banned entry to churches and temples. The third freedom is the freedom to desire, to want, which, translated into more mundane terms, means the person is economically fulfilled, guaranteeing a healthy economy, guaranteeing their livelihood, right? And the fourth freedom is freedom from fear, right? Which, translated into terms of today's world, is the reduction of dangers in the world. He said at the time, the dangers were increasingly weaponized, right? But anyway, it's the freedom to be, to have the security to exercise this liberation of the spirit, of thought, and of personal fulfillment, very, very current, right? And Biden is talking about lies and truth. It's another current thing that seems like a rehash of George Orwell's 1984, where in that fiction there was the ministry of truth. Today we have a ministry of truth, a court of truth, right, that decides what is true and what is false. Well, the Legislative Assembly of Mato Grosso yesterday approved by 19-2 the ban on requiring vaccination passports in the state of Mato Grosso. Now there has to be a second vote next month. Oh, the author is Representative Gilberto Catani. Oh, the bill considers differential treatment for not having a vaccination certificate to be discrimination, which is a violation. This discrimination violates Article 5, line 15, which is freedom of movement in peacetime. Of course, municipal decisions are stronger. That's what the Supreme Court's jurisprudence is, right? For example, in Santa Catarina, I've already mentioned Lontras and Rancho Queimado, municipal decisions can override a state decision. Still talking about this, right? Talking about vaccines and such, okay? I saw in Estado in Aparecida de Goiás, right? It's right there in the metropolitan region of Goiânia, right? A death was recorded, according to the news, from the Omicron variant, of a 68-year-old person with comorbidities, hypertension and chronic lung disease. She was vaccinated 3 times, right? Yeah, but on the other hand, right, I have updated data here from the Arequipa City Hall. It's on the Arequipa City Hall website. I compared the other day, one day with the other. Now comparing January 6th today with January 6th of last year, when there was no vaccination. There in Arequipa, 110,000 inhabitants. On January 6, 2021, there were 89 cases of COVID, today 99 cases, more cases with 90% of the population vaccinated. But look, today there are 2 hospitalized. A year ago there were 24 hospitalized, right? All this makes us realize that this new strain, which we're betting will be the end of the pandemic, right? Dora Avante will be, let's say, annual, the cycle and the vaccination, A, that it is very transmissible and not very aggressive, and the fact that it is highly transmissible, it also marks the person's immunity, right? It's more than a vaccine. Yes, that's what the doctors and those who are examining are saying. And by the way, the world's #1 tennis player is stuck in Australia. I mentioned him yesterday, right? Serbian Novak Djokovic, right? His visa was revoked. He's stuck in a room at the Carlton Hotel in Melbourne, right? And he'll have a court hearing on Monday. And he'll still have time, if allowed, to participate in the 2 major tournaments there. He's a record holder, winner of these competitions, but I think if he had free time, he'd be training, right? In his hotel room. I think it's unlikely he'd hit a tennis ball against the bedroom wall with a racket. Well, changing the subject a bit now, look, savings accounts in Brazil suffered, let's say, a loss, a balance of 35 billion in 2021. In other words, withdrawals exceeded deposits. And what was that for? Well, to support people who became inactive, right? Was it to buy vehicles? Look at data from Fena Brave. Registrations grew 10.5%. New vehicles were registered last year. The majority of them were trucks, 42%. This is a sign of economic activity. 42% were trucks, 26% were motorcycles, and car purchases decreased by 3.5% compared to the previous year, right? So it seems that many people use their savings to invest in transportation, trucks, and motorcycles, right? Passenger car was less, there was even a fall.
Hello, my friends. You are enjoying the holiday. Here in Brasilia, it is a double holiday, right? The inauguration of the new capital of the country, in addition to the memory of Tiradentes, who was the first movement for the country's independence. In fact, the independence of Minas Gerais. "230 years ago, he was hanged and quartered, and pieces of him were distributed throughout the streets of Rio de Janeiro to show, that the power of the Portuguese crown was at its peak. Well, he wanted to revolt using as a pretext the collection of 1/5 of the gold, or 20%. Today, we pay 35% in tax and Minister Paulo Guedes is doing everything he can to lower it, and the Vice President of the Chamber of Deputies is taking legal action to prevent the reduction of the IOF. Just imagine, by the way, sorry, IOF, not the tax on industrialized products, IPI, right? Well, 522 years ago, Cabral's fleet, led by Admiral Pedro Alvarez Cabral, on the 43rd day after leaving Lisbon, saw signs of land, birds, and seaweed. The next day, the 22nd, a Wednesday, he saw a very high, round mountain, which, according to Peruova de Camina, was Serra Verde, in Rio Grande do Norte. And then he landed and left a marker that was supposed to be in Touros, Rio Grande do Norte. He then planted another marker along the way to Cananea. One of the markers in Porto Seguro was interpreted by historian Van Hagen as the site of the discovery. But that is still under debate, right? For now, school books mention Porto Seguro. In 1985, Tancredo Neves died, having been elected president. In the same way that Castelo Branco, Costa Silva, Mais, and Gasol Figueiredo were elected. Elected president, Tancredo Neves died on April 21. And then Vice President José Sarney definitively assumed the vice presidency in place of what the Constitution mandated, who would be the president of the chamber, provisionally for 90 days, Dr. Ulysses, and who would call for elections that would already be direct, because the amendment for direct elections had already been passed. But the history of Brazil will still have to tell this very well, right? I'm just telling what I witnessed. Well, don't forget to subscribe and leave your like or dislike. Well, first of all, a correction, and I want to thank a website that I didn't know about, but I saw that it is very efficient, the website called Aos Fatos, which alerted me to what I said on the 11th, here on YouTube, because I spoke about the same subject 3 or 4 times and I only said it on YouTube. I only said it in our conversation that the Federal Court of Rio de Janeiro, a group of the court, decided to cancel a seizure of 695 kilograms of cocaine and 3 drug traffickers who were guarding the cocaine, claiming that there was no judicial authorization. I argued here that those who have cocaine are kept hidden, are caught red-handed, right? But the court didn't accept that. And in our conversation, I said, the cocaine was returned. And the website Aos Fatos alerted me to this, that the court and the federal police had informed that it could not be returned because it had already been incinerated by the federal police, right? So it was incinerated. Yes, it was returned, the drug traffickers were released. Well, today's big topic. I didn't talk to you yesterday because while I was recording, they were the ones judging. It was just one by one, you know, we were waiting for the result. Now it was 10-1 to convict Congressman Daniel Silveira, 39 years old, 1.90 meters tall. I must point out to you that I do not approve or endorse any of the rudeness he made. No, I don't like it, I don't agree with his style, but I defend to the last the Brazilian Constitution, in whose Article 53 it is written that congressmen and senators are inviolable civilly and criminally for any words, opinions and votes. In other words, if he speaks badly of the Pope's mother, so be it. The Constitution says that he is inviolable for any. But I don't know if the Supreme Court doesn't read the Constitution or what. It seems that there was only one there who read the Constitution, Minister Nunes Marcus. He was the only vote, the dissenting vote. He was sentenced to 8 years and 9 months in prison, and it seems that he is in semi-open prison, with a fine of $192,000, $1,000, and ineligibility for 8 years and loss of office. Just look, I would even say that it is ridiculous, it is not just ironic. The President of the Supreme Court, Justice Ricardo Lewandowski, presided over a trial of President Dilma in the Senate in which she was convicted, but she was not made ineligible for 8 years, as required by the Constitution. That day he did not order it. Sole paragraph of Article 52. There is another issue here that I do not know how a law student would accept this. When a judge, who is the offended party, in the Moraes case, is also the rapporteur of the case and votes. The other offended party also voted for Barroso. I learned from my grandfather that this is impossible, right? The judges who are offended do not participate. The entire court was offended. What is the court going to do? It was ex officio. The court started the process. These are incredible things. I saw here and more the seizure of the mandate. How so? If the Supreme Court itself in Criminal Action 470 of Menkelao in 2013 reaffirmed that the seizure of the mandate is only in the parliamentarian's own house, the Supreme Court. That was the exclusive decision. It's just that at the time the defendants were on the other side. The scales of justice are balanced there and justice should be blind, right? One, Minister Andre Mendonça went to social media to justify his vote, saying that as a Christian he could not accept the encouragement of violence. But he does not vote as a Christian, he votes as a guardian of the Constitution. And the Constitution, as you heard, says that deputies and senators are inviolable for any words. That's the crystal clear issue. The prosecutor, the public prosecutor's office attorney, Wright, who was in Lava Jato, coordinator of Lava Jato, from Lahore, posted on social media how interesting it was that José Dirceu was sentenced to 7 years and, after 2 years, the sentence was extinguished by the Supreme Court, right? Well, and now the victim or the complainant is the rapporteur, and for much less the Supreme Court said that Moro is suspicious and annulled Lula's convictions that were confirmed in the second instance, in the third instance, right? It's something like that we understand less and less, right? And those terrible things, right? Where did you see that, right? Well, another thing that was condemned a lot was that Moro talked to Dallenhall. Every judge talks to the prosecutor and the defense attorney. Every judge, right? Now we saw yesterday that it was on TV, there were little fights between the prosecution, the prosecutor, right, and the rapporteur judge. It's hard for us to understand all of this. Well, now we have a political prisoner convicted, at least that much, because before it was like in Cuba, the person is arrested, but there's no conviction, he just rots away, right? Because they've already arrested Zé Trovão, Alan de Souza, Alan, what's his name? Alan dos Santos, right? Wellington Macedo, Osvaldo Eustáquio, right? Well, all journalists for crimes of opinion, right? Roberto Jefferson, Daniel Silveira were also arrested. He was arrested, right? And now, finally, he's been convicted. Well, there's still room for a statement of objections that could push the matter back until the end of the year, when his term ends. And the Chamber of Deputies might be waiting for that. There's a certain feeling in the chamber after all the shock yesterday of not supporting the overturning of the mandate that represents 35,780, no, 31,789,789 voters. Speaking of voters, folks, the ZE confirms that it was canceling the voter registration of elderly people. Now it turns out that on Tuesday the TSS met and unanimously canceled the cancellation. The resolution is not valid for this year. You felt that everyone thought it was strange, right? Now, I continue to insist on what I said yesterday. The ZE has to run a campaign encouraging seniors not to let others make decisions for them. This morning I wanted to show you the photo because today the team that is preparing another series of live broadcasts from the General Vilas Boas Institute about the Amazon met. It will be in June, 3 series about health and technology in the Amazon. Here is the photo, the whole team gathered there with General Vilas Boas, taking advantage of today's holiday. And to conclude, all of this is part of the bicentennial of independence. This series is enlightening about the Amazon. Guys, did you know that 24 ships with Russian fertilizers are coming? $678,000 tons to guarantee our agriculture, which guarantees our table, which guarantees our trade balance. Thanks to the negotiations, President Bolsonaro with Putin, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Carlos Franca and the Minister of Agriculture, Teresa Cristina. Guarantee, right? I always end with good news, right? Mainly potassium is coming, right? But nitrogen too. But this potential that we have, the gas from our salt flat will end up leaving us in control of our nitrogen. From Brasilia, Alexander Garcia.
Hello, my friend. Time for our meeting this Sunday, November 24th. On November 24th, in 1859, Charles Darwin published his study, his book, his thesis, on the origin of species. He studied during a world trip, passing through Brazil, including Rio de Janeiro, then traveling along the Pacific coast from south to north, visiting the Galapagos and the Ecuadorian Pacific Islands, and concluding his theory of evolution. Coincidentally, a new planet has now been discovered, a baby that is only 3 million years old, and according to scientists, 10 times larger than Earth. Just look, Lucy, a female hominid fossil discovered in Ethiopia, is 3,200,000 years old. In other words, we primates, hominids, are at least 3,200,000 years old. Then Homo sapiens emerged, right? That's our genus. Yeah, but anyway, just to give us a sense of relativity, of our time, our size, and our existence. I'm in Santa Cruz do Sul. I'm at the hotel, and I see here that what happened in Rio Grande do Sul last year, in October, is more than the news led us to believe. The destruction is immense everywhere, not just in the big rivers, in the Guaiba estuary, but in the capillarity of what here in Rio Grande do Sul are called streams, ditches, everything destroyed. And the only effective solution is to clean the channels of all these waterways. But they're doing nothing so far, and it's been a year. My God. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like or dislike at the end. So, let's get to today's topics. Well, first topic. Yeah, I notice everywhere I go that the vast majority of people didn't believe this survey, at least not this summary that was made public, right? You notice that's where the consistency lies, right? Well, it was a thought by a very few, and it was an attempt, just a specter of planning, which didn't even come close to execution or consummation of a crime. So, we're wasting a lot of time with this. And deep down, it's propaganda, right? As Joseph Bell said, repeat it 1,000 times, 100 times, and many people will believe the story, right? But anyway, okay? Okay? Go to the Attorney General's office, which has already announced that it's only next year that you have to study hard. I see that those who studied law don't find due process in the whole, right? Which makes Brazil not exactly a democratic state under the rule of law, right? Anyway, I keep remembering, right? The Cohen Plan. Anyone who reads it, anyone who has learned contemporary Brazilian history knows what it's about. It was the pretext of a study by a captain, Captain Olímpico, Moura, a son, a study that was used by General Goiás Monteiro. Getulio Vargas liked the idea. They announced a major Jewish communist plot to launch an insurrection in the country, strikes, chaos, fires, and destruction to seize power. And then, 40 days after the announcement, Getulio Vargas, in 1937, declared the Estado Novo, new state, and closed Congress based on the Cohen Plan, which took the name of a Hungarian leader, Bela, and was inspired by that. It was all fiction, right? He took some facts, mixed them all together. Well, anyway, it was, an attempt at planning. That's why I hear people approaching me on the street, in taxis, 100%, every taxi I've taken here, right, 100%, saying the same thing, right, about it's a discrepancy and, at the same time, a revolt against whoever is behind all this, right? Well, let's move on. We're seeing a medieval inquisition there, right? Illegal solutions to things. Well, I noted here that we're still talking about this subject, right? I'm like, I'm a journalist, right? I'm proud of that. We have principles in our profession, one of which is to never accept official information as true, without doubt, with skepticism and, therefore, with a critical spirit. We critically examine the things we receive. And I see that courtiers applaud a priori, without critically reading the subject, right? Without realizing that it doesn't add up, that it doesn't make sense, that the presentation is very poor, right? Speaking of poor, there's a lawyer there. I wrote his name down here. Lawyer Cesar Bittencourt, from Tenant Colonel Sid, right? What an incredible thing. A lawyer so unprepared as to make a statement and then radically undo the previous statement. What the hell, my God, right? And then it just adds fuel to the fire of controversy. It's incredible. But more than that, right? Journalists turning into whistleblower fans, like those whistleblowers from the Soviet bloc, saying, look, the neighbor said this, so-and-so said that, we have to arrest him, we have to punish him, my God. Yeah, it's a disgrace, right? I don't know where something like that comes from, you know? Gossipy little things, right? And they look ridiculous. Ridiculousness is the worst way to ruin someone, right? Look, for example, just opening parentheses, my birthday is on the 11th and I want to get a new car. Mine is 3 or 4 years old, I want to get a new car. And I was researching the Jaguar, which I've never had a Jaguar, and I posted on the social network that I was interested. Then they sent me the Jaguar ad. My God, they went crazy. It's an ad to make people give up on the car and get scared of the brand. I've never seen anything like that. It seems like people are going crazy, right? I was actually really interested in a Volvo ad that values family, right? The other one devalues humanity, right? It seems like it makes humanity look like trash, and this one doesn't. This one enriches humanity and shows that it's a car that saves lives, right? I've had a Volvo before, and I really like the ad. Well, let's get back to it. Hey, I found out last night that all the colonels of the military brigade of Rio Grande do Sul signed a note of repudiation. That crazy PEC proposal from the Ministry of Justice that revokes the Federation, right? Because it centralizes public security, like in the times of Getulio Vargas, after the Estado Novo coup, right? When he intervened in all the states except Minas Gerais, appointed interveners. Hey, and then there was a meeting in Florianopolis this weekend where the governments of the South and Southeast said the same thing. No, no way. No way. Public security will be removed from the states, leaving the central government to give orders for each state's public safety guidelines, which would be given by the central government, which is absurd, right? It's just another attempt. We don't know that authoritarianism is controlling all this, right? And may it not reach us, right? Because around 1215, King John Lackland had to sign the Charter of Rights, right? And we need individual freedom, the freedom to undertake, right? What we need is a liberal ideology. Freedom. Freedom is above all. Freedom to grow, freedom to live, freedom to be happy or to suffer, right, according to the destiny that each person imposes upon themselves, but not ever increasing nationalization. This is bad for companies and especially for us. From from Santa Cruz do Sul, Alexander Garcia. Hello, my friend. It's time for our meeting for this Sunday's conversation, February 9th. You've noticed that a new, bright star is emerging on the Brazilian political horizon. Her name is Hugo Moda. I'm going to talk about that today, and you'll learn all about it. But today, on February 9th, near Porto in Portugal, in 1909, a star was also born. She projected Brazil into the world almost as much as Pelé, especially in the United States. Carmen Miranda. She came to Brazil when she was 1 year old and was brilliant in Brazil. She went to the United States and became the Brazilian bombshell, right? The Brazilian bombshell. She made many films, at least 6 or 7 films, television programs. She died on a television program starring alongside Jamie Durante. She died in Beverly Hills, California, at the age of 46. I remember her funeral in 1955, the burial in Rio de Janeiro, firefighters, crowds in the streets. I even think it was a holiday when the body arrived. And on a day like today, on the 18th of 1918, one of the greatest Brazilian heroes of World War II was born, Lieutenant Apollo Hesk. He was a Lieutenant R2. He tried to get into the Resende School, but he couldn't because he had flat feet. He wanted to be in the infantry, but with the war he got in, took the officer's course and was a Lieutenant R2, in the Sampaio Regiment of Rio de Janeiro. He shone in Monte Castello, La Serra, and was decorated by the Americans. He has the highest decoration that a Brazilian has ever received from the Americans for heroism, including being wounded. He died at the age of 81 in Rio de Janeiro, and the officer representing the American Armed Forces on the day of the wake thought that the tribute we were paying him was not enough. He thought that in the United States, a war hero receives a remarkable, gigantic tribute. Not here. I imagine, holding a wake at the Monument to the Dead. It seems that he died in 1999. The monument was already there. There should be news in newspapers and on television showing his deeds. What I've been saying is that we are a masochistic country that doesn't like heroes. Our heroes are from the bandits, right? They are the Macima. My God. But anyway, let's move on, because today is a day of change. Don't forget to subscribe and, at the end, leave a like or dislike comment. Times of change, a change in the political climate, a change in our sadness of being a country without freedom of expression, relative democracy, a relative due process of law, a relative right to defense, a relative prerogatives of Congress, a relative inviolability of any opinions of our representatives, everything relative. But it's changing, it's changing. I'm going to talk about that, but first I wanted to talk about Counselor Ocasio. Again, after that Oceana phrase, Portugal belongs to the Portuguese, in fact, Brazil belongs to the Portuguese, Brasilia belongs to the Brazilians. Well, President Lula said that if it's expensive, don't buy it. That was said a lot. That's the most obvious thing in the world, right? I learned it from my mother. My mother would take me to Casalina on the corner in Cachoeira to buy shoes when I needed them. And I wanted those shoes there. My mother would say, "No, those shoes are too expensive, choose another one, right?" Until I chose one that was within my family's reach. Quote. That's obvious, everyone does that, right? Now, the way he is the President of the Republic gives this kind of advice. Obviously, everyone knows that, everyone who earns a salary and needs to eat knows that, right? But the way he talks is simplistic, it's even simplistic, right? Imagine if the supermarket is selling at that price because it wants to lose customers, right? It wants to charge more, it wants to make money, right? Supermarkets know that the smaller the profit margin, the more they sell, right? The lower the price, the more it sells. Now, you can't lower it, and who gives it the cost price? What is the cost price? The price of the merchandise plus taxes, plus salaries, plus social benefits, plus maintenance of the business, right? Well, if you do less than that, you'll end up losing money until you close down and lay off your employees and stop being a supply point. That's so obvious, and now the new one is his advertising agency with a marketing expert, Sidonio. Let's start with Bahia, where he won the election, where there are a lot of buy-ins, right? And Sidonio's hometown. Let's go there to demonstrate the president's popularity. Have you seen the pictures? Will he keep traveling and not have an audience? What he could find was there, but the rest was empty. Well, in the meantime, the First Lady is going to Rome. All roads lead to Rome. Well, accompanied by the Minister of Social Affairs, Wellington Dias, who gave an interview to Deuteller saying that the Bolsa Familia program needs to be increased and has already been reprimanded by the Civil House, the Presidency of the Republic and the Ministry of Finance. He is going there, to a meeting. Let me see what the meeting is. It is a meeting of a global entity on agriculture, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, right? What is it that was even published in the official gazette? It is interesting that the First Lady's travels are published in the official gazette, and when the newspaper asks for the First Lady's schedule, the palace responds that it is not subject to the transparency law, right? Because she is not part of the public service. It is an inconsistency, right? Well, the objective is to win the presidency of the Global Alliance to Fight Hunger, according to the newspapers. In other words, the objective is propaganda, right? The irony is that Lula has been talking about zero hunger since 2003, that is, 22 years, right? Of which 16 have been under the PT administration, and hunger is still gaining ground. Now I would like to talk about these meetings, which I even covered in Rome, at the FAO, which is also about agriculture and food, right? Countries are paying for them, countries are not. Taxpayers are paying for these bureaucrats to travel to these sinecure meetings. Come on, a meeting in Rome, the eternal city, the marvelous city, right? Well, taxpayers who pay, what is the result, right? Well, the result is to maintain poverty, to maintain dependence, and maintain clientelism and paternalism. Look, vote for me and then I'll give you Bolsa Familia. No freeing people. Where is the exit door for Bolsa Familia? Just teach people, prepare them, right? Teach them everything, prepare them to do something in life and earn good money. There is no public education for that. Well, hey, folks, I think a human rights delegation from the Organization of American States arrived today. After a lot of complaints, years of complaints, the delegation came. Do you know why? Because of the Big Bang. You know, the Big Bang, right? It was that explosion that caused, according to, right? It's a scientific explanation, right? A version of the beginning of the universe, a big explosion. There was a big explosion in the United States that will affect Brazil there in Washington, more precisely in the White House, the focus of the explosion. And then the OE that wasn't paying attention to the complaints about freedom of expression, broad right to defense, due process of law, political arrests. Suddenly they sent a committee. They'll only stay for 3 days. They arrive today, they'll leave. They arrive today, they really work. Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, it seems like they'll leave on Thursday. Maybe they'll have everything ready and they'll just listen to some people, listen to the other side, maybe. As a journalist, I am skeptical by nature, but look, if the EU doesn't move, there won't be any more money coming from the United States to support those who are around the sinecure of the O's, which has a beautiful headquarters in Washington. Right? And that's how it is. The World Health Organization, the same thing, right? The United Nations too, but they are coming. Let's see what happens. Coincidentally, anticipating the arrival of the O's Human Rights Commission, Minister Morais released channels that were blocked. Everyone is wondering, blocked based on what law? Right? Guilherme Fiuza. Let me see here. I wrote down the names. Guilherme Fiuza, Bernardo Kister. Who else here? Channels that had been blocked for a long time. I wonder now that they've been unblocked, who is going to compensate people? For the income they didn't have, for the losses they suffered. I hope it's not the Brazilian taxpayer, right? Hey, the monarch, hey, among others, right? Luciano rang too. Just look. Well, now I wanted to talk to you about the new president of the chamber, Hugo Mota, a congressman for the Republicans of Paraíba. He started as a congressman when he was 21 and has been there for 15 years. Guys, I'm standing in the front row applauding what he has demonstrated. Hey, just go in, if you want to check it out, just go to his channel, hey, on his X there on X, it's there. He posted the things he has said. So I wrote it down here for you to see the essence. Look, the legislature will never kneel down to the Supreme Court. From now on, if these decisions continue, decisions by the Supreme Court, a power that tries to wall off or corner a reaction. Defend the focus on expenses and not on tax increases. That's another issue. The state does not create wealth. You must have heard Mrs. Fatia. It is people and companies who create it. Raising taxes instead of cutting spending is impoverishing the country. You can't overburden those who are already carrying too much weight and deserve relief. Wow. Now you're talking to the executive branch, whose head is President Lula. The population is suffering with the price of food. Those who earn minimum wage can't fill their plates at home. The best way to control the price of food is to control public spending. And now, January 8th was an attack on the institutions, but to say it was a coup has to have a leader, support from the armed forces, but that didn't happen. There were vandals, troublemakers, but they can't be punished. A lady who was passing by, didn't do anything, didn't even throw a stone, and receiving a 17-year sentence in a closed regime is a certain imbalance in that. It was a sign that look, an amnesty project that comes to separate, right? Separate that precursor squad that opened the doors of the Planalto Palace and started to break in, and those who arrived later, even seeking shelter from the smoke of tear gas, right? In other words, personalize the investigations. Well, and then Gumoda, for me, is the man who is taking over to rescue the Constitution, due process, the broad right to defense, the prerogatives of those who represent the Brazilian people, which is the origin of power, including, mainly, the inviolability of any opinions, freedom of expression, right, to eliminate arbitrariness, abuse of authority, right? Well, just so we know, Congress is the most important of the powers, the most important legislative power. It can do almost anything, but it can't change the Petra Clause. And the Supreme Court has already changed it and even transferred it to mayors to change the right to come and go, the right to assembly, etc. The Petra Clause, yes, of Article 5. It can't change the Petra Clause, only an assembly elected to be a constituent assembly, but it can revoke the law, change the law, it can remove the President of the Republic, remove a minister from the Supreme Court, right? It has power. So, there's a star rising on the political horizon of Brazil. And from what I heard in interviews with the President of the Senate said that he does not dismiss any subject from being discussed, right? So, the phrase in Latin is grace et justice. Justice goes hand in hand with grace, right? And there is no revenge from Brasilia. Alexander Garcia.